Hi everybody, Professor Xavia here. Hope you're having a good day. I thought I would take a little time and talk to you about presenting your work. Public speaking is one of the most common fears people have, and one way to address that fear is to be prepared. So there's a few tips. I've been presenting my work for decades now. Don't want to admit to how many, but I've had some wins and some losses, and so hopefully I could share some of those lessons that I've learned with you today. So first off, some kind of big things to think about, or kind of broader kind of themes before you even get to your work. So one of the first things is to think about who your audience is and dress the part. So how do you want your audience to perceive you? And again, it depends on who the audience is. If you're giving a community talk, you probably want to look like the scholar or researcher that you are. If you're giving an artist talk and showing your visual essay, you might want to dress a little artsy. And if you are consulting for a large corporation, you probably want to wear your business suit. So just some general things. Keep in mind, we always talk in sociology about presentation of self, and so that's step one in figuring out how you're going to go about putting your presentation together. If you feel like you look the part, it's easier to actually act the part. So that's step one. The next thing you'll want to do is find out just how long you'll be speaking for. So if you're defending your thesis or your dissertation, or giving a keynote, it'll probably be around 45 to 50 minutes that they want you to speak, and then leave some time for questions. If you're giving a conference presentation, it's generally between 15 and 20 minutes that they want you to speak. It's always wise to make sure, often if there's a discussant, your time will be 15 minutes so that there's time for the discussant to talk about your paper, or they want to have extra questions, depending on what it is. So I always advise people to plan on a 15-minute talk, and usually even if it does say you're going to get 20 minutes, because often when people get up, especially if they're nervous, they talk a lot because they think they don't have enough to fill up the time and it's going so quickly, and often they end up talking longer than they should. So just keep that in mind. Less is more when planning out your time. You don't have to say everything you ever learned or ever knew about a specific thing when you do this. Okay, the next thing to think about is what kind of format will you be using? So do you plan to use PowerPoint or some other kind of projection? In the old days we used slides, but thank heavens those were costly and we don't have to do that anymore. But you do think in terms of your presentation, in terms of the images that you're going to have on the screen. Or if that's not appropriate for this presentation, think about whether you want to have handouts. If you have handouts, unless it's really important for everybody to know every single thing about your project, I would have handouts that only hit the high points. So something like an abstract and contact information, perhaps. I wouldn't do the PowerPoint handout option and give somebody 26 slides. Well, you shouldn't have 26 for a 15-minute presentation anyway. Okay, so format. So once you've figured out your format, then you can move on to thinking about how to go about putting that together. So a few pieces of advice. We've all sat through really boring presentations, especially those with lots of PowerPoints, with lots of text that you can't really read unless you squint. So step one, if you're going to use something like PowerPoint, make sure that your font size is large enough to be read by the old people at the back of the room. Make sure that the contrast is good. If you have light yellow on light gray, nobody's going to be able to read it. So high contrast is important for readability. The other thing to think about is to try and keep your words to a minimum. Ditch the bullet points. Nobody wants to see bullet points. So I would ditch the bullet points and think more in terms of thought-provoking words that you might use, and keep it simple and keep it brief. And of course, the other thing is photographs or images. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so why not simplify by using an image if that's something that's appropriate and possible for you. And once you've got your kind of format figured out, you've figured out who your audience is and what they would be most interested in, I would advise you to kind of step back for a minute from your project. One, think about, oh, why do I always number everything? Well, think about why you chose to do the work that you do. Maybe there's a personal story that would be of interest to help your audience arrive at the same interest that you did. Start to think, what's the best way to lead your audience into the presentation you plan to make? Emotional stories are best, personal stories are great. It's not as frequent in an academic setting, but if you've watched any TED Talks, notice they almost always start with a personal story or a story that leads you into the topic. One way to, there's usually an emotional component, because we've found in the research that emotional moments are more likely to be remembered than just a cognitive understanding of something. So if you can tell a story that evokes emotions in your audience, whether it's surprise, horror, sadness, sad is probably not the best way to start, but that's partly why people used to start with jokes. Please don't do that. That's 1960s, old school. But you do want to grab your audience's attention and bring them along. Think of your presentation as a narrative story, something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginning is where you want to get their attention so they want to stay with you to hear about this fabulous project you've done and all these great insights that you're going to bring to the world from this project. Okay, so I'll talk about a conference presentation, because that's probably the most common thing you'll find with regard to presenting your research. So I will talk about it like it's a PowerPoint presentation in terms of the different slides that you would use. So to start, a title slide. And on your title slide, put your name and your affiliation, what company you work for or what university you're at. You can put your credentials if you want, all those lovely initials at the end of your name, if that's appropriate for your audience. If you're talking to an audience that's really not going to care if you have a master's, then you can skip that. And you'll be surprised how many people forget to put their contact information on their title slide. So I always do my title, my name, my university, and then 2 spaces down, I'll put my email address on it. Just so, because I hope I'm going to impress everybody so much that they want to get in touch with me at the end of the presentation. So the other thing I do with my title slide is I duplicate it and I make it my final slide too. So it's there with your contact information and your name as people are asking questions at the end of your presentation. And it gives them one more chance to figure out who you are and how to contact you if they want to. Okay, so after the title slide, that's where you get to your substance. So you'll start with some sort of introduction, something that just gives people an idea where you're going. And this would be a great time to bring in some sort of personal story to kind of grab them. If you have come to this research project because of some personal experience you've had, or something that happened in your family, or something that you saw as you were at the beach one day, if you can start with a story to give an introduction to your project, it's a good way to get the audience ready to come with you. So an introduction that basically grabs the audience and gives them a clue as to where you're going to go. You'll also want to include your research questions or your research topic as you move from your introduction into what we would call the lit review, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So make sure you have your kind of focus up there, and it might be the end of your story. I became really interested in looking at how gender played out as a dynamic between office workers in X kind of setting, because that was my summer job or something, or my internship. So think about that as a way to kind of move into your project focus and or research questions. So end your introduction with that. Then the next slide would be, or component to your presentation would be your the link of your project to previous research, or things that we thought we knew that you're going to tell us is very different now. So how did previous research impact and influence the way that you've gone about this? And does your project agree or disagree? Does it extend work that's been done, or does it bring a whole new insight to what's happening? Okay, so link to the literature. Don't tell everybody every single article that was ever written about gender. Just pick the 2 or 3 that were the most important for helping you think about your themes and patterns that you found. And we talked about that in a previous video. Okay, so you have introduced your project, you have ended up with your research questions and moved on to the relevant literature and why it's relevant. Don't just list it as important, but say why. This article was important because it helped me to flesh out the ideas I had about power dynamics with regard to gender. Whatever it is, tell people why you're telling them that. Okay, and that should be pretty short. You don't want to spend too much time, 5 minutes max, because that would only leave you 5 more minutes to talk about your data, your results and your findings, and your methods, then your results and findings, and then your conclusions. So if you spend 5 minutes on the front end, that only leaves you 10 minutes for the back end. So keep that in mind as you go forward. So the next one, the slide, would be your methods. And this often can be just one slide that you tell people what you did, basically. I used participant observation to conduct an ethnographic study of skateboarders in this setting, in an urban setting, urban park. And I was in the field for 4 months during the spring of 2020, whatever it is. Or I conducted interviews with 17 women and 26 men between the ages of 15 and 32 who were active in the skateboard culture. I'm making this up. I don't know if that's even relevant for people that age. But nonetheless, that's what you would put, what you did. Now, if in the case of interviews, this often comes up, you want to give the demographics of your sample. This would be a place to put a chart if it doesn't turn out to be too small of type. So if you can find a way to put it together that my sample, the 17 women, 15% were African American, 22% were Caucasian, and 33% were Asian Pacific Islander. If you could put that in one line and then another line for the men in the study, that would be a good way to talk about race characteristics, and you've already included gender. So if there's anything else that's important, maybe religion or any of those other kind of independent variables that you want to tell your audience about, you would try to put them in short table form, and that makes it easier for you. And you don't have to talk the whole way through. You could just share the demographics. Okay, so try to keep your methods short and sweet, and you can always say, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end of this about my methodology, which is a way of saying I can't tell you everything, but I'm happy to answer your questions. So get the methods out of the way quick. Then move on to your data, your results and your findings. Here you will present your themes. What are the 3 themes that you found? Stigma, gender, ageism. Okay, those are the 3 things. What's the story that your data is telling? How do those themes relate? How did you arrive at that? You often with methods you want to put at the end that I analyzed my data using the methods of qualitative research or grounded theory, whichever you prefer. So presenting your data, your results and your Your analysis, your results and conclusions would come at this point. And it's nice to have at least half your time left, so 7 to 8 minutes for this portion. 9 is even better because of course you want to talk about this fabulous data that you have. And with qualitative, quantitative people just put up a chart with statistics and coefficients and regression, and what's statistically significant, etc. So they can put everything up in a slide. Putting up a paragraph of text, not so fascinating, but it's commonly what people will do in our field. If you have an image to go with the text, which given confidentiality you may not have, that's fine, but that helps make it a little bit more interesting. So present your data. You'll present your themes and then usually 2 to 3 examples of that theme in the data. And those are usually quotes, either from your field notes or from interview transcripts. And again, 3 is plenty for a theme. Just make sure they're the most compelling quotes that you can come up with. And if you started telling your story at the beginning using like a case study of one of your respondents, you might carry that through with your themes. If this is the one that's the most articulate and really represents better, then that might be the prominent quote person that you quote throughout, but then have supplemental quotes so that you are sharing that it wasn't just this one person that said this, that this is truly the pattern that arose from all the hard work you did collecting your data. Okay, and conclusions. What limitations does your study have? I was only able to be in the field until March when the stay-at-home, stay-safe order went into effect, so I wasn't able to collect the other 3 months of data that I had planned to be in the field. That would be a limitation. I wasn't able to get access to X population, which would have really fleshed out my findings. IRB was concerned about X and so would not give me approval to ask these 2 questions that I would have really liked to have known the answer to. So limitations, what limits did you find as you went through? And often those are the things that you have to kind of address as they arise. They come through the process of doing the research. The other component to this is what's the logical next step? So your work is so fabulous that it should be extended with additional research on XXX. Where does your work lead? What's the next logical step that another interested scholar would want to pursue? How would they extend your work to actually bring more insight? And then you might say what you plan to do. That's another way of how the research kind of has legs, what comes next. So my next project, I expect to be able to extend this by interviewing more individuals in the skateboarding community at another urban park in another setting, because I think that summer weather in LA might be a difference than New York City with its long winter. Whatever. So that's how you would end with your kind of conclusions, and then it's always wise to say, I look forward to any comments and questions you have. And then sit down. And whoever is organizing the meeting will either ask you to stay there while people ask questions. Usually the presider will call on people and then you'll answer the questions. Or you will sit down and the next presenter will come up. Conference talks, usually there's 3 to 4 presenters in a session, and the most common way to run the session is to have everybody give their presentation and then open it up for questions if there is no discussant. Otherwise, the discussant then talks about all the papers in turn at the very end, and then they open it up for questions and or comments from the presenters about what the discussant said. So that's in general kind of how it works to give a conference presentation. So hope this is helpful. Don't be too worried. I know some people think of sociology as a blood sport and they're out to get to prove that they know more than the presenter. But in general, you are going to be the one that knows the most about your data and what happened while you were in the field, what they said to you, what you saw, what you witnessed, how you felt. All of that, you have primary knowledge. So don't let anybody intimidate you and create anxiety, because it'll all be okay. And this is how you share your research with the world. That's kind of half the fun of doing this work is putting your findings out there to kind of help other people have a new understanding of something. It wouldn't be the same to just do all this work and then put it in a box in the closet, right? So this is what you do. So think of your story, bring your audience along, let them know how fabulous your project was and how fascinating your setting or interviewees were and why this is so important, and they really want to hear all you have to say. All right, hope that's helpful. Good luck, have a good time. Yeah, when you get up to the podium, take a deep breath, smile, and then enjoy yourself. Okay, take care. See you next time. Bye.